Emma Langston had never been the kind of person to shy away from confrontation. Running a chain of successful restaurants in a city where competition was ruthless had toughened her up, but nothing could have prepared her for the battle she was about to face. When her older brother, Mark, passed away unexpectedly, he left her his house a sprawling, slightly outdated but solidly built home on the outskirts of an affluent neighborhood. It wasn't a place she had ever planned to live, but the memories tied to it were strong. They had grown up in that house before Mark inherited it from their parents, and even after she had moved away for college and then business, it remained the only place that felt permanent in her ever-changing life. At first, she had considered selling it, but something about the way Mark had always talked about the place made her hesitate. He had insisted it was special, that he had fought to keep it outside of the grasp of the increasingly powerful neighborhood association that had swallowed every other property in the area. At the time, she had thought he was exaggerating. Now, she wasn't so sure. When Emma moved in, she had no reason to believe anything was wrong. The house had stood on the same patch of land for decades, and despite its age, it was in remarkably good shape. She made a few minor repairs, had the locks changed out of habit, and settled into the quiet of suburban life. The neighbors were polite, if a little cold, but she chalked it up to the usual wariness that came with someone new moving in. It wasn't until the first letter arrived that she started to understand why Mark had been so adamant about keeping the property out of the association's reach. The envelope was thick, high-quality paper embossed with a gold emblem. Inside, a formal letter welcomed her to the neighborhood and outlined the necessary adjustments required for her home to remain compliant with community standards. The list was long and absurd. The front door had to be repainted to match the approved color scheme. The driveway, which was perfectly functional, needed to be repaved with a specific type of brick. Even her mailbox was apparently a violation too modern, they claimed, despite it having stood there for as long as she could remember. At the bottom of the letter, there was a clear warning failure to comply would result in escalating fines and, if necessary, further action. Emma tossed the letter aside. She wasn't part of the association. She had never signed anything, never agreed to any rules. The house was hers, legally and unequivocally, and she had no intention of bowing to a group of people who thought they could dictate how she lived. She had dealt with entitled customers, aggressive business competitors, and corrupt city officials. This was just another power play. A week later, another letter arrived, this one more urgent in tone. The fines had already begun accumulating, it claimed, despite her having never acknowledged the first notice. Along with it came an invitation, no, a summons to meet with the association's president, Ronald Bishop. The name was unfamiliar, but the tone of the letter made it clear that he was used to being obeyed. Emma wasn't. She arrived at the association's office, an imposing brick building that looked more like a courthouse than a community center, and was immediately struck by the sterile atmosphere. Everything was pristine, controlled, as if someone had painstakingly designed it to project power. The receptionist barely acknowledged her before directing her to a conference room where Bishop was already waiting. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with an immaculately pressed suit and the kind of smug, unwavering confidence that came with years of unchecked authority. His smile was polite, but it never reached his eyes. "Miss Langston," he greeted, gesturing for her to sit. "I was beginning to wonder if you would come at all." "I wasn't planning to," Emma admitted, leaning back in her chair. "But your letters are getting pretty insistent, so I figured I'd put an end to it in person. I'm not part of your association. My brother wasn't either. This house is not under your jurisdiction, and I have no obligation to follow your rules." Bishop listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he folded his hands on the table and sighed, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Miss Langston, I understand your confusion. But things have changed. Your brother's refusal to comply was unfortunate, but the community has moved forward. Your property is now considered part of our jurisdiction, as outlined in the updated charter. I can assure you that this is not a matter of personal choice. If you live here, you are subject to our regulations." Emma narrowed her eyes. "That's not how property law works." Bishop gave her a slow, deliberate smile. "It's how it works here." The meeting ended without resolution. Bishop remained cordial, never raising his voice, never making overt threats, but the message was clear: she was either with them or against them, and they didn't tolerate outliers. Over the next few days, things escalated. First, small inconveniences: a garbage truck that mysteriously stopped picking up her trash, a service technician who canceled her appointment at the last minute. Then, more direct tactics. A notice appeared on her door claiming her home was in violation of multiple ordinances. When she tried to contest it, she was told the paperwork had already been filed and the fines were non-negotiable. Then, one morning, she stepped outside to find that her car, which had been parked in her driveway the night before, was gone. Not stolen. Towed. The company claimed it had been abandoned on private property and refused to release it without a hefty fee. Emma was furious, but she wasn't stupid. She knew what this was: pressure, intimidation, a deliberate attempt to break her down until she complied. But she had built her business from the ground up, fought through economic crashes, legal battles, and personal losses. She wasn't about to fold because some overgrown HOA with a god complex wanted to play dictator. That night, she installed cameras around the property. If they wanted a fight, she would be ready. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. It was past midnight when she heard the sound metal scraping against concrete, a deliberate, grating noise that sent a chill down her spine. She moved quietly to the window, careful not to be seen, and peered outside. Her front gate, the one she had locked herself, was open, and standing in her driveway, silhouetted by the dim glow of the streetlights, was Ronald Bishop. He wasn't alone. 3 men stood behind him, their faces obscured by the darkness. Emma's breath caught as Bishop stepped forward, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He raised a hand, and the men fanned out, surrounding the house. Then, with the same infuriating calmness he had shown in their meeting, Bishop reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. He pointed it directly at her front door. And then he spoke, his voice carrying through the quiet night like a judge delivering a sentence. "Miss Langston, this is your final warning. You either belong to us, or you don't belong here at all." Emma's hands tightened into fists at her sides as she stood frozen behind the curtain, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. Bishop remained still in her driveway, the gun in his hand not moving, his presence a quiet, suffocating force that sent a clear message. The men flanking him stood with the kind of rigid alertness that suggested they weren't just here to scare her. This was a coordinated effort, calculated and deliberate, not some impulsive act of desperation. These weren't men who bluffed. They had come prepared to make good on their threats. For a brief, reckless moment, she considered flinging the door open and demanding to know what they thought they were doing, calling their bluff, daring them to make their move. But she knew better. If she stepped outside, she wouldn't be the one in control of the situation. Bishop had chosen this moment, this method, for a reason. He wanted her off balance, afraid, uncertain about what would happen next. He wanted her vulnerable. Slowly, she backed away from the window, careful not to make a sound. She grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed 911, pressing the device to her ear as she moved toward the back door, her mind racing through possible exits. The line rang twice before connecting, but as soon as she spoke, the dread in her stomach curdled into something cold and sharp. "This is 911. What is your emergency?" Emma swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "My name is Emma Langston. I'm at my home, and there are men outside, armed, threatening me. They say I have to join." The line went silent, not cut off, not static, just dead air. She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the screen. The call was still connected. The timer ticked on, but no one was there. "Hello," she tried again, her voice rising. "Can you hear me?" "I need help." Nothing. Then, just as suddenly as the silence had begun, the line disconnected. A new notification flashed onto her screen: "Call failed. Please check your connection." Emma's grip tightened around the phone, a sickening realization sinking in. This wasn't a technical glitch. This wasn't a bad signal. This was deliberate. Someone had intercepted the call, cut her off before she could explain the situation, before she could get any real help. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the porch light outside flickered once before going out completely, plunging the front yard into darkness. She needed to move. Now, slipping through the back door as quietly as possible, Emma made her way toward the tree line behind the house. The yard was bordered by thick brush that led to an empty lot, and beyond that, a narrow, winding road that eventually connected to the main highway. If she could reach it, she could flag down a passing car, get as far away from the house as possible, and figure out what to do next. But she had barely made it 10 steps when she heard the first set of heavy footfalls behind her. They were inside. She flattened herself against the side of the house, her heart pounding as she listened. The front door hadn't been forced open. There was no sound of splintering wood, no crash of broken glass. They had a key. They had walked right in as if they owned the place. A voice, low, calm, terrifying in its certainty, cut through the night. Miss Langston, Bishop called out, his tone almost conversational, as if they were old friends discussing something as mundane as the weather. Running is not the answer. You don't have anywhere to go. We have your car, your phone won't work, and soon you won't have this house either. Emma clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe quietly, evenly. She needed to think. She had always been good at making decisions under pressure. Her entire career had been built on the ability to handle problems as they arose, to adapt, to outmaneuver competitors who thought they could squeeze her out. This was no different. The stakes were higher, but the strategy remained the same: control the information, control the narrative, find the weak point, and exploit it. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, Bishop continued, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He was inside now, moving through her home like he had every right to be there. You're not the first to resist, but you will be the last. Your brother made this mistake, and look where it got him. The mention of Mark sent a bolt of fury through her, a heat that cut through the fear clouding her mind. But she didn't let it consume her. She filed it away, let it sharpen her focus instead of blind her. A soft chime echoed from inside the house. A phone, not hers. They were calling someone. Emma took a slow, careful step toward the tree line, but before she could disappear into the cover of darkness, Bishop spoke again. 10 seconds, Miss Langston, he said, his voice still maddeningly composed. Then we start treating this like a trespassing situation. And I'm sure you know how we deal with trespassers in this community. Emma had no doubt that whatever they were planning, it would end with her either in handcuffs or in a shallow grave. And then she saw it. The one thing she hadn't accounted for. A car, not one of theirs. A single set of headlights cutting through the night as a vehicle turned onto the distant road, moving slowly, the driver likely unaware of the scene unfolding just beyond the tree line. It wasn't much, but it was an opportunity. She had seconds to act. Emma sprinted. She broke cover, tearing through the brush toward the road, her legs moving before her brain could register the full consequences of what she was doing. Behind her, voices shouted, the sound of boots pounding against pavement, as they realized she was no longer cowering in the shadows. A gunshot cracked through the night. A warning. Or maybe a promise. She didn't stop. The car was closer now, the headlights illuminating the curve ahead. She stumbled onto the pavement, arms waving, lungs burning. The driver slammed on the brakes. The car, a sleek black sedan, stopped just feet from where she stood. The window rolled down, and the driver, a man in his 50s, his face lined with the kind of weariness that suggested he had seen too much, looked at her with a mixture of concern and calculation. "Help me," she gasped, forcing the words past her lips before her legs gave out beneath her. She didn't hit the ground. The man caught her, his grip firm but not unkind. Behind them, the men from the house slowed their approach. They weren't reckless. They wouldn't risk making a scene unless they had no other choice. "Please," she repeated, gripping the man's sleeve. "They're trying to kill me." The man glanced up, his gaze shifting past her to Bishop and his men. A beat passed. Then he nodded once. "Get in," he said, and Emma, without hesitation, did. The car door slammed shut just as the first of Bishop's men reached the edge of the road, their movements halting as the sedan's headlights cast them into sharp relief. Emma barely had time to process the sensation of the smooth leather seat beneath her, the cold air from the vents blasting against her face, before the driver shifted into gear and the car lurched forward. The acceleration pinned her against the seat, her body still running on pure adrenaline, her heart pounding so loudly that she barely heard the man beside her mutter a curse under his breath. She turned her head, watching as the figures in her driveway grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but they didn't give chase. They didn't need to. They knew exactly where she would end up. Emma clenched her hands into fists, trying to will herself into some semblance of control. The fear hadn't left her, but she forced herself to breathe, to take stock of the situation. She was still alive. She had escaped, at least for now. But she had no idea who this man was, no idea where he was taking her, and no idea what the hell she was supposed to do next. She glanced at him sideways, taking in his appearance for the first time. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that flicked between the road and the mirror, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with a tension that suggested he was just as aware of the gravity of the situation as she was. His suit jacket was slightly rumpled, his tie loosened, but there was an edge to him, something controlled and dangerous beneath the surface. Emma swallowed hard, still breathless. "Who are you?" The man exhaled through his nose, his focus never wavering. "Doesn't matter right now. You need to listen to me very carefully." Emma's pulse was still racing, but she forced herself to nod, knowing she didn't have the luxury of arguing. "They're not going to stop," he said. "You think you've gotten away, but you haven't. This was just the beginning." Emma's jaw tightened. "They have no legal right to my house. I never signed anything." "My brother." "Your brother understood what he was up against," the man interrupted. "And I'm guessing he didn't tell you half of it." Emma blinked, thrown by the certainty in his voice. The man continued, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You've seen how they operate. This isn't about bylaws or property disputes. It's about control. And right now they don't have it over you. That makes you a problem." Emma's stomach twisted, because she already knew he was right. Bishop and his people weren't trying to fine her into compliance. They weren't just harassing her. They were eliminating resistance piece by piece, just as they had likely done before. She looked down at her hands, forcing herself to stay grounded. "I need to go to the police." The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think they don't own the local cops? They intercepted your 911 call. You really think filing a report is going to do anything?" Emma's fingers curled against her thighs. She wanted to argue, but deep down she knew the truth. The moment she had lost connection to emergency services, she had understood just how deep this ran. She inhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do?" The man turned the wheel, taking a sharp exit off the main road. The streetlights grew sparser, the houses more distant, until they were driving through an area that seemed half abandoned, old warehouses and shuttered businesses flashing past the windows. Finally, he pulled into a lot behind a building that looked like it had been closed for years. He put the car in park, but he didn't turn off the engine. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a worn envelope, and handed it to her. Emma hesitated, then took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she peeled it open. Inside were photographs. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. The images were grainy, black and white, the kind taken from surveillance cameras or hidden lenses. But as she flipped through them, her breath caught in her throat. They were of her house, her front door, her backyard, her bedroom window. And then, her brother. Emma's throat tightened. The photo was dated 6 months before Mark had died. He was standing outside his house, a tense expression on his face, a familiar figure standing in front of him. Bishop. In the next picture, Mark was gone. Just Bishop remained, his back turned, as if walking away from something. Or someone. Emma's grip on the photo tightened. "What is this?" The man exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Evidence." Emma's stomach churned. Of what? The man's jaw tightened. Your brother didn't just die, Emma. He was removed. The words sent an icy wave through her veins, but she refused to break. Why are you showing me this? The man leaned forward, his eyes hard. Because I want you to understand exactly what they're capable of, he paused. And because you're running out of time. Emma forced herself to breathe, to push down the rising panic threatening to take over. If this was true, if Bishop and his people had orchestrated Mark's death, then she was already in more danger than she had realized. And if they had gone to such lengths to erase him, then they would do the same to her without hesitation. She looked up at the man, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. So what do I do? The man studied her for a long moment before finally answering. You do what they don't expect. Emma swallowed hard. Which is? The man turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. You stop running. She stared at him, trying to process his words, but before she could respond, something outside caught her attention. A single black SUV had pulled into the lot, its headlights off, its engine idling in the darkness. They had been found. The man cursed under his breath, throwing the car into reverse, spinning them out of the lot just as the SUV's doors opened and two figures stepped out. Emma barely caught a glimpse of them before the sedan sped down the street, tires screeching as the other vehicle began its pursuit. She gripped the armrest, her breath shallow. You said they weren't expecting me to stop running. What the hell do you call this? The man's jaw clenched as he swerved onto a side street, expertly maneuvering through the dimly lit roads. We're not running, he said. We're setting the stage. Emma swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the envelope in her lap. She didn't know if she trusted this man. She didn't know if she could survive this. But one thing was certain. The game had changed. And she wasn't going down without a fight. The engine roared as the sedan tore through the empty streets, the black SUV gaining ground behind them, its headlights flicking on at the last second, illuminating the road like a predator locking onto its prey. Emma could feel the tension radiating from the man beside her, his grip on the steering wheel ironclad, his knuckles white under the dull glow of the dashboard. She had no idea where they were going, no idea who he was or how much he really knew, but she understood one thing with absolute certainty: if that SUV caught up to them, she wasn't going to walk away from this night alive. The tires screeched as they took a hard left, the rear end of the car fishtailing slightly before he corrected the wheel. Emma twisted in her seat, her pulse hammering as she saw the CV close the gap, deliberate and relentless, its driver not reckless but methodical, as if they had already decided how this chase would end. A second vehicle turned onto the road behind them from a side street, another set of headlights flashing in the mirror, boxing them in. Not good, the man muttered, shifting gears, pushing the car harder. The speedometer climbed, but the road ahead narrowed, the buildings on either side pressing closer, the alleyways shrinking into darkness. Emma didn't recognize this part of the city: industrial, mostly abandoned, warehouses with broken windows, rusted fences curling inward like the skeletons of something long dead. They're trying to trap us, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. They think they already have, he corrected, eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. He exhaled sharply. Hold on. The car jerked as he yanked the wheel to the right, cutting into a narrow service road between two crumbling warehouses. The pavement was uneven, potholes jarring the suspension, but the maneuver caught their pursuers off guard. The SUV behind them overshot the turn, forced to slam its brakes before reversing to correct course. The second vehicle, however, had anticipated the move. It swerved into the alley from the opposite side, headlights locking onto them like a spotlight. Damn it, the man hissed. They're better than I thought. Emma barely had time to register what was happening before he made his move. Instead of slowing, instead of trying to find another exit, he floored the gas. The sedan surged forward, straight toward the oncoming vehicle. The other driver hesitated just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for uncertainty to creep in before swerving hard to avoid a head-on collision. The black car clipped the edge of a dumpster, metal shrieking as it spun out, giving them the opening they needed. The sedan shot past, breaking free of the trap, the way ahead suddenly opened. Emma exhaled, her muscles locked with tension. Where are we going? The man didn't answer immediately, his focus still on the road, on whether the CVs would recover and resume the chase. Finally, he took a breath, adjusting his grip on the wheel. Somewhere they won't follow. Emma frowned, but before she could ask what that meant, he took another sharp turn, the city falling away behind them, the glow of streetlights fading as they moved into the outskirts, where the road stretched empty and dark, leading nowhere good. For the first time, she felt something worse than fear. Isolation. The buildings thinned out, replaced by barren lots, abandoned motels with broken neon signs flickering like ghosts from another time. The road stretched on, cutting through the darkness, leading them further from the safety of crowds, of cameras, of witnesses. Emma didn't like it. "Stop the car," she said suddenly. The man didn't react, his hands steady on the wheel. "I said stop." Still nothing. She reached for the door handle, fingers wrapping around the metal, ready to jump if she had to, but the moment she moved, he sighed and eased off the gas, the sedan rolling to a gradual stop on the side of the road. The engine idled, the silence thick between them. Emma turned to him, her pulse still hammering. "You need to start talking." He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his options, then nodded. "Fair enough." He killed the engine, the world around them sinking into stillness, nothing but the whisper of wind against the car. Then, finally, he turned to face her. "My name is Declan Graves," he said, "and if you want to survive this, you need to listen to everything I'm about to tell you." Emma didn't move, didn't speak, waiting. Declan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Your brother was a smart man, but he made one mistake. He thought he could fight them alone. He thought logic and the law would protect him. He was wrong. They don't play by those rules." Emma felt her throat tighten. "You knew him?" Declan nodded. "We worked together. Not directly, but we had a common enemy." His expression darkened. "And now so do you." Emma swallowed hard, her grip tightening on her lap. "Who are they?" Declan was silent for a long moment, staring out at the empty road ahead, as if measuring the weight of the truth before dropping it on her shoulders. "They're not just a neighborhood association," he finally said. "They're part of something bigger. Something designed to look harmless, to make people comply without realizing they ever had a choice. They start with small things, fines, regulations, little rules that seem reasonable at first. Then they push further. They isolate. They manipulate. They control." Emma's stomach twisted. "And the people who don't comply," Declan's jaw tightened. "They disappear." The words hit like a slap, cold and absolute. Emma forced herself to breathe. "So what now? Do I disappear too?" Declan turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Not if we do this right." Emma narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly does doing this right mean?" Declan leaned forward, resting his arms on the steering wheel. "It means we stop playing defense." Emma shook her head. "I don't even know what I'm up against. You're telling me there's some massive operation controlling people through fake housing laws? That's insane." Declan didn't flinch. "Is it? You saw how fast they shut down your call for help. You saw how easily they took your car, froze you out of your own life. Do you really think that kind of power comes from a few angry neighbors?" Emma hated that he was right. Declan studied her, then sighed. "You want to fight back? Then you need to stop thinking like a victim." Emma's jaw tightened. "And start thinking like what?" Declan's lips quirked into something almost resembling a smile. "Like someone who's already won." Emma exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The past few days had been a nightmare, a whirlwind of confusion and fear, of being one step behind, of never knowing what would happen next. She had been reacting, scrambling to keep up, to survive. But Declan was right. That wasn't going to work anymore. If she wanted to win, she needed to change the game. She needed to become the threat. Emma straightened, her gaze steady. "So what's the plan?" Declan smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We go back." Emma felt her pulse skip. Back. Declan nodded. "We make them think they've won." Emma swallowed, adrenaline coiling in her gut. She didn't know if this was a mistake. She didn't know if she could trust Declan, if he really had the answers, if any of this would work. But she did know one thing. She wasn't running anymore. Emma had spent her entire life adapting to situations she couldn't control, but nothing had prepared her for this. Sitting in the passenger seat of a car driven by a man she barely knew, plotting her next move against a force that had already demonstrated its ability to erase people without consequence, she felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her. Declan's words still echoed in her mind. We go back. It was insanity. It was suicide. And yet, it was the only option that made sense. If she ran, she would be hunted until they found her. If she tried to expose them without proof, no one would believe her. The only way forward was through. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as Declan pulled the car back onto the main road, their detour into the outskirts nothing more than a brief moment of clarity before the storm that was coming. The SUV that had been following them was gone for now, but they both knew it wouldn't last. They had made their move, and Bishop wasn't the kind of man to let defiance go unanswered. Declan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You sure you're ready for this?" Emma clenched her jaw. "No, but I don't have a choice." He nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then here's how it's going to work." As they drove, he laid it out. She couldn't just walk back into her house and pretend nothing had happened. Bishop would see right through it. She needed to sell it, make it look like she had been broken, that she had realized she was fighting a losing battle, but at the same time she needed to be careful. Too much compliance too quickly, and it would look suspicious. They had to believe she had reached the inevitable conclusion that so many before her had reached submission. Emma hated it. Every instinct in her body screamed against it, but she understood why it was necessary. They needed to get inside, close enough to see how deep this really went, close enough to find something that couldn't be ignored. She had spent too much time reacting, too much time scrambling. This was her chance to take back control, and she wasn't going to waste it. By the time they reached the edge of the neighborhood, she felt the tension settle deep in her bones. The streets looked the same as they had before, the houses neat and uniform, the lawns perfectly trimmed, the atmosphere eerily quiet, as if the entire place had been designed to suffocate anything resembling resistance. It was a lie built on order, a carefully constructed facade where compliance was the only acceptable form of existence. Declan pulled over a few blocks away from her house, keeping the car running. "This is where I disappear," he said. "You go in alone." Emma frowned. "That's it." For now, his gaze was sharp. "If I walk in there with you, they'll know something's off. You need to make it believable." Emma exhaled, gripping the door handle. "And if they don't buy it?" Declan smirked. "Then you improvise." She rolled her eyes, but there was no humor in it. Without another word, she stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind her. She didn't look back as he drove away, disappearing into the night like he had never been there at all. Her house was exactly as she had left it, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too thick. She took a steadying breath and walked up the steps, forcing herself to keep her movements measured, controlled. The moment she stepped inside, she knew she wasn't alone. They were waiting for her. Bishop was sitting in her living room like he belonged there, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Two of his men stood near the doorway, their expressions unreadable, their presence a silent warning. The air smelled like expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her stomach tighten. Emma forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to let him see even a flicker of hesitation. "Enjoying yourself?" Bishop smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Welcome home, Miss Langston." He took a slow sip of his drink, watching her. "We were starting to think you'd decided not to come back." Emma dropped her keys onto the table with more force than necessary. "What choice did I have?" Bishop raised an eyebrow. "Ah." A moment of clarity. She shrugged. "A moment of reality. You've made your point." Loud and clear, she gestured around her. "Consider me officially compliant." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Bishop studied her, as if waiting for a crack in her performance, waiting for the moment she would break. But Emma had spent years negotiating in boardrooms, holding her ground against men who thought they could intimidate her into submission. This was no different. Finally, Bishop nodded, as if satisfied. He set his glass down and stood, smoothing out the wrinkles in his suit. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "It's so much easier when people accept the inevitable." Emma didn't respond. Bishop stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But just so we're clear, you're not free yet. Compliance is earned, not declared." His smile was sharp. "You'll prove your loyalty. One way or another." Emma held his gaze. "And if I don't," Bishop's smile widened, "then we'll be having a very different conversation." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Emma didn't move as he walked past her, his men following without a word. The front door closed behind them with a quiet finality, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of a house that no longer felt like her own. She exhaled slowly, forcing her muscles to relax. It had worked. For now. But she knew better than to think she was safe. Bishop wasn't a man who trusted easily. He would be watching her, waiting for a misstep, waiting for proof that her surrender was nothing more than an act. Which meant she had to play the part perfectly. Over the next few days, she did exactly that. She followed the rules, repainted the front door the approved shade of beige, hired a landscaper to make the yard look appropriately manicured, signed the documents Bishop's people provided, careful to appear resigned but not bitter. She needed to be just compliant enough to keep suspicion off her without looking like she was trying too hard. And all the while, she gathered information. Every conversation, every interaction, every seemingly insignificant detail, it all became part of the puzzle. She learned which houses belonged to true believers and which ones housed people like her, people who had fought and lost. She learned that not everyone who disappeared had moved away voluntarily. And she learned that Bishop wasn't the one pulling the strings. There was someone above him, someone worse. She found the first clue late one night, tucked into the mailbox of an abandoned house on the outskirts of the neighborhood. A single piece of paper, folded and worn, the edges yellowed with age. They watch. They listen. They wait. Don't trust the ones who smile. Emma stared at the note, her heart hammering. Someone had left this for her. Someone who knew the truth. And then, just as she was about to tuck it away, a shadow moved at the end of the street. Someone was watching her. She turned, shoving the paper into her pocket, forcing herself to walk back to her house at a normal pace, forcing herself not to look over her shoulder. But she could feel it, the news tightening. Bishop was testing her. And if she wasn't careful, she was going to fail. Emma moved through the house in calculated silence, each step measured, each breath controlled, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. The shadows outside her window stretched long under the dim glow of streetlights, casting eerie silhouettes across the walls. She could feel them watching. They had been for days, but tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just under surveillance tonight. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. She had spent the past week playing the perfect role, painting herself as the broken woman who had finally learned her place, bowing her head just enough to keep suspicion at bay while she worked tirelessly to uncover the truth that had cost her brother his life. And now, after days of careful observation, patient listening, and quiet deception, she had it. The note had been the turning point. The cryptic warning left in the abandoned mailbox had been more than just a message. It had been an invitation, a sign that she wasn't alone, that there were others who had seen what she had seen and had survived long enough to try and fight back. The problem was, she had no idea who had left it, no idea if it was a trap, no idea if she was already one step behind. But it didn't matter anymore. Bishop and his people had overplayed their hand, tightened their grip too much, and now they were on edge. She could see it in the way they moved, the way their eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, the way the patrol cars passed by more frequently, their slow crawls down the street, a deliberate warning. They were waiting for her to crack. She wasn't going to. She had spent the past few days memorizing routines, mapping out weaknesses, noting who entered which house, which doors had reinforced locks, which security cameras were real, and which were just for show. She had learned that Bishop never went anywhere without two men at his side, but more importantly, she had learned that he wasn't the one she needed to be afraid of. There was someone above him, someone whose name was never spoken, whose authority was never questioned, someone who dictated the rules of this neighborhood like a king overseeing his kingdom. Bishop was just an enforcer. And Emma was done playing by his rules. She moved to the desk in the corner of the living room, pulling open the bottom drawer where she had hidden the flash drive Declan had given her. It contained everything he had managed to gather before their paths had crossed: financial records, altered property deeds, lists of homeowners who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It was undeniable proof that this wasn't just about an overreaching neighborhood association. It was organized, deliberate, and far-reaching. These weren't just power-hungry men with too much time on their hands. They were cleaning house, erasing people like her, like Mark, like God only knew how many others. She closed her fingers around the drive, exhaling through her nose as she slid it into her pocket. It wasn't enough to expose them, not yet. She needed more. Something that couldn't be dismissed, something that even the most corrupt officials couldn't bury. And she knew exactly where to get it. She grabbed her coat, moving toward the door with controlled purpose. If she hesitated now, she'd lose her nerve. She had spent too much time waiting, watching, planning. Tonight, she took action. She stepped out into the night, her heart steady despite the tension knotting in her stomach. The street was quiet, the air thick with the kind of stillness that felt too intentional. She kept her head down, walking with purpose but not urgency, making her way toward the one house she had never seen anyone enter or leave: the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The one with the perfectly trimmed hedges and the too clean driveway, the one that didn't belong. The house where the real power was. She reached the gate, pressing her hand against the cold metal, eyes scanning for movement. Nothing. No guards, no patrols, no sign of life at all. That alone made her stomach churn. They were either too arrogant to think anyone would dare approach, or they were already waiting for her. She climbed over, landing softly on the other side. The house loomed before her, its windows dark, its facade pristine, untouched by time or nature. She made her way to the side entrance, reaching into her pocket for the small tool Declan had given her, a slim, modified key that could bypass most standard locks. She slid it into place, twisting just enough to feel the mechanism shift. The door clicked open. Her breath hitched. Too easy. She stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole, the silence pressing against her ears like a warning. She moved carefully, each step deliberate, controlled. The house smelled sterile, unused, like it had been cleaned just hours before, and as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she realized why. It wasn't a house. It was an office. She moved down the hallway, her fingers trailing against the wall until she reached the study. The desk was immaculate, not a single paper out of place, but the drawers were locked. She pulled out the tool again, working quickly, her movements precise. One lock gave way, then another, and finally the bottom drawer slid open. Inside there were files, dozens of them. She pulled one out, flipping it open, her stomach twisting at what she saw. Names, addresses, photos, surveillance photos. Her breath caught in her throat. These weren't just people who had lived in the neighborhood, these were people who had vanished. Dates were scribbled in the margins, notes detailing last sightings, assets acquired, properties transferred. Some pages were marked with red slashes through the names. Others had no marks at all. Then she saw it, her brother's file. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep reading, scanning the notes for anything, any detail that could tell her what had really happened to him. And then, status relocation incomplete. Awaiting final clearance. Emma's breath hitched. Mark hadn't just been killed. He had been taken. Her vision blurred with rage, but she forced herself to focus. She snapped photos with her phone, capturing as much as she could before sliding the files back into place. She couldn't take them, not yet. If they realized someone had been here, they would burn everything. She turned to leave, but the second she stepped into the hallway, she felt it. The shift in the air. The presence behind her. She didn't hesitate. She moved. She spun just as the figure lunged, barely dodging the first strike, her pulse spiking as she threw herself backward. The man was fast, too fast, but she had been expecting this. She kicked out, catching him in the ribs, the impact sending him stumbling. The moment of hesitation was all she needed. She ran. Footsteps thundered behind her as she tore through the house, heart hammering, lungs burning. She crashed through the back door, vaulting over the fence, just as a voice shouted behind her. Get her! She hit the ground running, ignoring the sting of scraped palms, the ache in her ribs. She sprinted through the shadows, dodging between houses, her mind racing. She had proof. She had the truth. But now they knew, and they were coming for her. Emma ran until her legs threatened to give out, until her lungs burned and her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. The night air was thick and heavy, pressing against her skin as she moved through the streets, her body screaming for rest, but she didn't dare stop. They were behind her. She didn't need to look to know it. She could feel them, hear them, their footsteps distant but steady, relentless in their pursuit. She forced herself forward, pushing past the pain, past the exhaustion, because she knew what would happen if they caught her. The documents she had found in that house, the files, the proof, she had risked everything to get them, and now they wanted her silenced. She could still hear Bishop's voice echoing in her mind, calm and certain, his confidence cutting through the chaos like a knife. You won't make it far. He had meant it. He hadn't needed to yell, hadn't needed to run after her himself. He had spoken as if the outcome was already decided, but he was wrong. Emma wasn't going to disappear. Not like Mark. Not like the others. The darkened streets stretched ahead, empty and unwelcoming. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, silent, pristine, an illusion of normalcy. The houses stood untouched, their windows dark, their doors closed. No one was watching. No one was helping. The people inside weren't asleep. They were pretending not to hear. A set of headlights flared to life behind her. Her stomach dropped. The low hum of an engine filled the silence, the sound slow and deliberate, creeping forward as if savoring the moment. She forced herself not to turn around, not to give in to the panic rising in her chest. She wasn't out of options. Not yet. Then, just as the vehicle picked up speed, another set of lights appeared ahead. A different car. Faster. Moving toward her, closing the distance. Declan. Emma didn't hesitate. She veered toward the road, her legs barely carrying her, her breath catching as the SUV behind her accelerated. The roar of the engine sent adrenaline surging through her veins, but Declan was already there, tires screeching as his car cut between them. The door flew open, and he ordered. Emma dove inside just as the SUV behind them slammed to a stop. A figure emerged, moving fast, but Declan didn't wait to see what they would do. The car lurched forward, tires gripping the asphalt, speed overtaking hesitation. The moment the doors locked, Emma finally turned, her pulse hammering as she looked out the rear window. Bishop stood in the street, watching them go. No anger. No frustration, just patience. That terrified her more than anything. They drove in silence, the city blurring past them, streetlights casting fleeting glows across Declan's face. His grip on the wheel was firm, his expression unreadable, but Emma could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them both. You got it, his voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. Emma nodded, pulling the flash drive from her pocket. I have everything. Declan exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly before he forced them to relax. Then we're not going home. Emma turned to him fully, exhaustion pushing against her skull, but she shoved it aside. We need to get this out. To who? She hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? If they went to the police, the case would vanish before it even started. The local government was compromised. The media? Even if they believed her, what could they do? Declan sighed, already reading her mind. We need something bigger. Emma stared down at the flash drive, the weight of it feeling heavier than before. Then we find the people they've already erased. Declan's eyes flicked to her. For the first time in hours, she saw something close to approval. "You're thinking like someone who wants to win," he muttered. Emma exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the drive. "I don't want to win," she met his gaze. "I want to burn them to the ground." The car sped into the night, the city shrinking behind them. There was no turning back now.